On the night of January 20th, 1973, a winter storm moved into downtown Boston. It was not an unusual storm for New England in January. Wind, cold, the kind of weather that Bostonians put their heads down into and keep walking. At approximately the same time the storm hit, dozens of 4-foot by 11-foot panels of blue reflective glass began separating from the facade of the John Hancock Tower on Copley Square. Each panel weighed 500 pounds. Each one fell from whatever floor it had been attached to. Some fell 60 stories, some hit other panels on their way down. Those panels fell too. The glass did not fall in slow motion. It did not give pedestrians on Trinity Place or Clarendon Street a chance to step aside. It fell the way 500-pound objects fall from the tallest building in Boston, immediately, without warning, into the street. The building was still under construction, not finished, not occupied, not opened. Still being built, and it was already shedding its skin. By April of 1973, more than an acre of the John Hancock Tower's mirror glass facade had been replaced with black-painted plywood. Bostonians gave the building a new name, the Plywood Palace. And here is what the Plywood Palace was hiding. Not just a window problem, a structural problem. A structural problem that Harry Cobb, the architect of the tower, a partner at I.M. Pei and Associates, discovered when he hired a Swiss engineer named Bruno Thurlemann to review the building's structural integrity after the windows started falling. Thurlemann was the world's leading authority on high-rise steel frame buildings. Cobb called him. He said, "We're in trouble, Bruno. Can you come over?" Thurlemann came. He ran the calculations. He came back to Cobb with something worse than a window problem. He announced that, according to his calculations, under certain rare but entirely possible wind conditions, the Hancock might fall over. The 60-story, 790-foot tallest building in New England, on Copley Square, 1 block from Trinity Church, might fall over. The windows were the warning. The building itself was the story. That is the beginning. This is the rest of the story. Here is what the plywood covering an acre of the building's facade does not explain. The plywood was a public fact. Bostonians could see it. Tourists photographed it. Architecture critics wrote about it. The Plywood Palace nickname circulated within weeks of the boards going up. What was behind the plywood, what the investigation into the window failures was simultaneously uncovering about the building's structural behavior and wind, was not a public fact. It was a private file, in the offices of I.M. Pei and Associates, in the offices of the structural engineers, in the hands of John Hancock Insurance, which had commissioned the building, which was the primary tenant, whose name was on the tower, whose corporate reputation was attached to a building that was simultaneously shedding its windows and being assessed for the possibility that it might topple in a wind event. The investigation ran from the spring of 1973 through 1974. The structural engineer retained to solve both problems, the window failures and the building's dangerous dynamic response to wind, was William Le Mesurier, a name that appears, improbably twice in the history of American skyscrapers that had structural secrets hidden from the public. The same William Le Mesurier, whose Citicorp Tower in New York would be discovered 5 years later in 1978 to have a 1 in 16 annual probability of collapse under quartering winds. The same man. 2 buildings, 2 structural secrets. One engineer who chose confession over silence both times, and whose repairs, in Boston in 1973 and 1974, and in New York in 1978, were completed while the buildings were occupied, while the public was not informed, while the cities in which those buildings stood continued their normal operation beneath structures that their engineers had privately concluded were not as safe as their certificates of occupancy indicated. This is the story of what Le Mesurier found behind the Plywood Palace, and what he did about it. Start in 1966, Boston, Copley Square. The John Hancock Life Insurance Company commissions I.M. Pei and Associates to design a new corporate headquarters in the Back Bay. The brief is ambitious, not just a corporate office building, a landmark, the tallest building in New England, a building that would anchor Copley Square, already one of the most architecturally distinguished urban spaces in the United States, framed by Trinity Church, the Boston Public Library, and the original John Hancock building, with a structure worthy of the company's identity in the square's historic context. Henry Cobb, a partner at the firm, takes the design. His concept is one of the most genuinely original in American skyscraper history, a 60-story rhomboid, not a rectangular box, a parallelogram in plan, a tower whose 4 faces are not perpendicular to each other, and the material, blue reflective glass, all 10,344 panels of the facade, 4 feet by 11 feet, each panel a mirror of the sky and the buildings around it. From the right angle, at the right time of day, the entire building disappears. It reflects Trinity Church back at itself. It reflects the clouds. It reflects the sky. It is, as architecture critics describe it when the building finally opens in 1976, the best example of contextual high-rise architecture in the United States, a tower that uses its reflective surface to acknowledge everything around it rather than imposing itself on the square. And in 1966, this is a genuinely unprecedented design, not just aesthetically, technically. Blue reflective glass had been used in buildings before, never at this scale, never in a 60-story tower in New England's winter climate, never in a glass system that was being asked to perform on a building with this specific geometry. A rhomboid form that creates unusual aerodynamic conditions around its perimeter that presents its surfaces to the wind at angles that had never been tested in a building of this height. The glass is the design. It is also, as events will prove, the building's structural destiny. Construction begins, the foundation is excavated, and the first problem arrives before the first floor is poured. Here is what the excavation does not explain. Copley Square sits in Boston's Back Bay. The Back Bay is not bedrock. It is landfill. It is, quite literally, artificial land, built on fill, with a water table that sits close to the surface, with clay and mud beneath the fill layer, with the kind of subsurface conditions that geotechnical engineers describe as challenging, and that the structural engineers of the 1960s did not fully account for when planning the foundation of the John Hancock Tower. During the excavation for the tower's foundation, temporary steel retaining walls were erected to hold back the clay and mud fill surrounding the excavation. The walls warped. The clay and mud pushed through. The shifting soils damaged utility lines beneath the streets. They cracked the sidewalk pavement. They threatened the foundations of the buildings surrounding the construction site, including Trinity Church, the 1877 H.H. Richardson masterpiece directly across St. James Avenue from the construction site, one of the greatest works of American architecture, with a foundation that was not designed to absorb the lateral forces produced by a neighboring high-rise excavation in unstable Back Bay fill. Trinity Church won an $11 million lawsuit for repairs to its foundation and structure. That was the first lawsuit. It was not the last. The excavation stabilized. The foundation piles were driven. The steel frame went up. And the glass went on, and then the glass came off. Stop here. Because what the bond between a lead-coated steel frame and a double-pane reflective glass panel actually does when that panel is simultaneously being asked to accommodate thermal expansion, wind-induced vibration, and the dynamic motion of a 60-story building in a New England winter, and why the bond that was supposed to be the window's strength was actually the mechanism of its failure, is the part that 3 years of investigation finally answered. Here is what the John Hancock Tower's original window actually was. The panel is double-pane glass. Not for thermal performance in the ordinary sense. The two panes sandwich a layer of chromium, a reflective metallic coating with an air gap. That is what gives the building its blue mirror appearance. The chromium layer reflects the sky. The air gap provides the dark backdrop that makes the reflection visible. The outer face of the panel is bonded to a lead-coated steel frame. That frame is what connects the glass panel to the building's curtain wall system. That frame is what holds 500 pounds of glass against a 60-story building in a 70-mile-per-hour winter wind. The bond between the lead coating on the steel frame and the glass panel is strong. That is the problem. Not too weak. Too strong. Here is why. Glass expands and contracts with temperature. In Boston, a south-facing panel experiences summer temperatures above 100 degrees Fahrenheit on the sunlit face and winter temperatures below 0 degrees at night. That is a thermal range exceeding 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Glass moves across that range. It expands when it is hot. It contracts when it is cold. It moves in tiny amounts, fractions of millimeters, but it moves. Glass also vibrates under wind pressure. Not dramatically, not visibly, but measurably. The panel flexes slightly under wind load. It returns. It flexes again. This is the behavior the glazing system must accommodate. The bond between the glass and its frame must be flexible enough to allow this movement. The bond must give when the glass expands, give when the glass contracts, give when the wind flexes the panel, and return the panel to its original position without retaining any residual stress in the material. The bond in the John Hancock Tower's original glazing system was not designed to give. It was rigid. When the panel expanded thermally, the bond resisted. The glass strained against the lead frame rather than sliding within it. When the wind flexed the panel, the bond transferred the bending stress into the edge of the glass rather than absorbing it. At the corners of the panel, where the geometry of the frame produces the highest stress concentration, the glass experienced repeated thermal and dynamic loading that the material could not sustain indefinitely. First cycle. The panel expands. The bond strains. The glass accumulates a small amount of residual stress at the corners. Second cycle. The panel contracts. The bond strains again. The residual stress accumulates further. 10th cycle. 100th cycle. 1000th cycle. The glass at the corners has been stressed more times than its designed fatigue limit allows. The panel cracks. At the corner, at the connection to the frame, where the bond would not give, the crack propagates. The panel separates from the frame. 500 pounds of glass, from whatever floor it was on, falling, without warning, to the street below. This happened 65 times during construction. This happened in the January 1973 storm, when dozens fell at once. This happened every time the wind reached 45 miles per hour, which, in Boston, happens regularly. The police closed the surrounding streets whenever winds approached that threshold, which meant that every significant storm in New England produced a situation where the tallest building in Boston was closing Copley Square to pedestrians because its windows might kill someone. For 3 years, from 1973 to 1976, while the investigation ran, while the plywood covered an acre of the facade, while the building's structural secrets were being uncovered behind the boards. Here is what the window investigation uncovered about the building beneath the windows. When Harry Cobb hired Bruno Thurleman to review the structural integrity of the John Hancock Tower, Thurleman did not find a window problem with structural implications. He found a structural problem that was independent of the windows, a problem with how the 60-story steel frame rhomboid responded to wind. The rhomboid shape of the tower, the quality that made it architecturally original, that made it visually distinctive, that allowed it to reflect Trinity Church rather than block it, produced aerodynamic behavior that the engineers had not fully anticipated. The building's asymmetric plan created torsional responses to wind. When wind pushed against one of the building's non-rectangular faces, the tower did not simply sway in the direction of the wind. It twisted. The floors rotated slightly around the building's vertical axis. At the upper floors, the occupants experienced this rotation as a swaying motion that was different from and more disorienting than the straightforward sway of a conventional rectangular tower. In high winds, people on the upper floors of the Hancock Tower became seasick. They vomited. They could not stand upright. They had to leave their offices. The motion was not just uncomfortable, it was not just a quality of life problem, it was a structural warning. A building that twists under wind to the degree that occupants become nauseated is a building that is not responding to wind the way its structural engineer designed. In Thurleman's calculations, the calculations he brought back to Harry Cobb with the announcement that the building might fall over under certain wind conditions, were about this twist, about the combination of the building's natural oscillation frequency and the vortex shedding that occurs when wind passes around a tall asymmetric structure. Vortex shedding produces rhythmic pressure variations on the building's faces. If those pressure variations occur at a frequency that matches the building's natural oscillation period, the result is resonance. The building sways more and more with each cycle, not because the wind is getting stronger, because the building's own dynamic properties are amplifying the effect. In a square or rectangular building, vortex shedding from opposite faces produces pressure variations that partially cancel each other. In a rhomboid building, the geometry means the cancellation is incomplete. The twist amplifies rather than dampens, and at certain wind speeds, the calculations showed, the building's response would not stabilize at a manageable sway. It would diverge. The sway would grow with each cycle. Without mechanical intervention, the building could topple. Lemessurier's solution was the same one he would later apply to the Citicorp Tower in New York. A tuned mass damper, 2 of them, each weighing 300 tons, installed on the 58th floor of the John Hancock Tower. 700 in concrete blocks on frictionless oil films, connected to pneumatic springs, calibrated to swing at the same frequency as the building's oscillation period, but 90 degrees out of phase. The dampers absorb the energy that the building would otherwise accumulate in a resonant wind condition. They cancel the amplification. They turn a building that might fall over into a building that sways within acceptable limits. The dampers were installed. The window glass, all 10,344 panels, every single one, was replaced with single-pane tempered glass. The lead-coated steel frames were redesigned with flexible bonding that allowed the glass to move. The original glass manufacturer bore the cost of the replacement, the total cost of the original window system, approximately $5 million, the cost to replace it paid by the manufacturer, the cost of the damper installation, the structural modifications, and the construction delays that pushed the building's opening from 1971 to 1976, folded into a total cost that climbed from the original $75 million budget to $175 million before the building finally opened. More than double. 5 years late. A plywood palace for 3 of those years. And the building that opened in 1976, the building that stands today at 200 Clarendon Street, the tallest building in Boston, the blue mirror that reflects Trinity Church back at itself every day, is not structurally the building that was designed. It has 700 tons of concrete counterweights on the 58th floor that were not in the original design. It has 10,000 E-244 replacement glass panels that are thinner, simpler, and less architecturally ambitious than the originals. It has a structural modification history that was, for the longest time, not fully discussed in the architecture press, because the settlement with the original window manufacturer included a confidentiality provision. The details of the glass failure investigation, The specific cause, the specific failure mechanism, the specific calculation that showed why the bond was too strong were sealed for years. The architectural record, in a remarkable article published during the investigation in 1973, wrote the following sentence about the investigation into what was happening to the John Hancock Tower. The glass story, as harrowing as it is in itself, is not the story of the John Hancock Tower. Quite simply, the glass story, as harrowing as it is in itself, is not the story. A journalist in 1973 wrote that sentence without knowing what the full story was. They were right. The window panels were the symptom. The structural dynamics under wind, the calculation that suggested the building might fall over, was the disease. Both things are true about the John Hancock Tower at 200 Clarendon Street in Boston. By any measure of architectural achievement, it is one of the most significant skyscrapers constructed in the United States in the second half of the 20th century. A 60-story rhomboid in Boston's Back Bay, designed by Henry Cobb of I.M. Pei and Associates, the tallest building in New England from its completion in 1976 until 2010. A structure so visually precise in its relationship to Copley Square that it has been described as the best example of contextual high-rise design in American architecture. A building that uses 10,344 panels of reflective glass to reflect Trinity Church, the Boston Public Library, and the sky above the Back Bay, rather than imposing itself on a historic urban space. A tower that architecture critics, once they could finally see it properly rather than through the plywood, called a masterwork. A building that has stood for nearly 50 years on Copley Square without further structural incident, the permanent headquarters of a Boston skyline that would not be recognizable without it. And it is also a building whose original glass panels, all 10,344 of them, 500 pounds each, designed by the world's leading reflective glass technology of 1966, began separating from the facade during construction and falling onto the streets of Copley Square. A building that wore plywood over an acre of its facade for 3 years and was known as the Plywood Palace by every person in Boston. A building whose structural investigation, commissioned after the windows started falling, produced a private calculation delivered by the world's leading authority on high-rise steel frame structures that said the building might fall over in certain wind conditions. A building that required 700 tons of tuned mass dampers, an engineering intervention that did not exist in the building's original design, to prevent the resonant vortex shedding that its non-rectangular geometry produced in high winds from growing to a structural failure. A building whose foundation excavation damaged Trinity Church, cost its owners $11 million in legal damages, and threatened the structural integrity of one of the greatest works of American architecture across the street. A building that was projected to cost $75 million and ultimately cost $175 million, 133% over budget, and opened 5 years behind the original schedule. A building whose window failure investigation was partially sealed by a confidentiality agreement with the original glass manufacturer, who paid the replacement cost of a glazing system that was replaced in its entirety before a single resident or tenant could work in it. A building that Boston's architecture critic Robert Campbell described in 1995 as a cardiac case that had things up its sleeve of an unforeseen nature that no one, in their wildest imagination, would have thought possible. The Plywood Palace. The building that might fall over, the tower that got better, the building that has stood for 50 years since the plywood came down. Both things are true. The building is magnificent. The building nearly wasn't. And the man who calculated that the Hancock might fall over, and who designed the dampers that made sure it didn't, is the same man who, 5 years later, discovered that his own building in New York had a 1 in 16 annual probability of collapse. William Le Mesurier. Twice. 2 buildings, 2 structural secrets that the public did not know. 2 solutions made in private. 2 buildings that stand today, 200 Clarendon in Boston, 601 Lexington in New York, because an engineer chose to say, "We're in trouble. Can you come over?" Both buildings are standing, the plywood is gone, the dampers are working, and the glass that replaced the glass reflects the sky above Copley Square every day exactly the way Henry Cobb designed it to. With 10,344 panels, none of which weigh 500 pounds, none of which have fallen since 1976. Both things remain permanently true. The most beautiful building in Boston almost wasn't a building at all, and the city still walks under it every day without knowing what it took to keep it standing.